Hello, and welcome to Field Lab Earth, the podcast that's all about past and present advances in the fields of agronomic, crop, soil, and environmental sciences. This is part one of a two-part episode where we'll be talking to Doctors Paula Comeau and Christina Hargiss about plant blindness in children's art. Paula will be the first guest that you hear on this episode. What is plant blindness? How do we know people have it? How can researching plant blindness in children help us build better resources and programs for adults? Answers to all these and more coming right up. I'm your host, Abby Morrison. Let's talk about science. Just a quick show announcement before we get started here. If you are a certified crop advisor or a certified professional soil scientist, we are now going to be offering continuing education units for our show. Simply listen to each episode and then take the associated quiz. They're available on certifiedcropadvisor.org or in our show notes. Let's get started. Hi everyone, welcome to the show. Today we have Christina and Paula with us. Christina is an associate professor at North Dakota State University. She has degrees in science education and received her PhD from North Dakota State University in natural resources management. Christina's research focuses on environmental education, wetland ecology, water quality, water use, stormwater, and the effects of energy development on natural resources. Paula is the scientific and natural area naturalist for Region 1 for the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources and adjunct faculty for the North Dakota University System. She has an interdisciplinary background with a bachelor's in zoology, a master's in English, and her PhD in natural resources management from North Dakota State University. Paula's research focuses on prairie reconstructions and restorations, environmental education, and origins and impacts of plant blindness. Welcome to the show, ladies. How are you doing today?
Good. Thanks for having us.
Great. Thank you.
So glad to have you. So we're going to get started. This is actually part one of a two-part episode series on plant blindness. So can you guys just give me some background on what plant blindness is?
Well, plant blindness is this phenomenon that is becoming more known and more popular that regards a general lack of people's ability to see and notice plants and appreciate their value in a global way and in a regional, local way as well. And so generally people they don't see them as things that are contributing to their environment, their society, and they're seen as more of the backdrop rather than players within a global ecosystem.
Excellent. And you guys were working on a project to start with that actually involved adults. Can you tell me a little bit about that and how you transitioned into the project we'll be talking about today?
Well, originally, my dissertation research wanted to focus on field guides and why field guides are so challenging to be used. And we figured that using third graders as kind of guinea pigs in the beginning would be a good baseline so that anything a third grader would recognize would be something that an adult would be able to recognize as well when it came to IDing plants. And what we very quickly found was that even third graders had an inability to really see plants, even as young as 9. And so that led us more into this research where we focused on third graders as kind of this tipping point in development, as what a third grader views is very similar to what an adult will view. And so we use them as our study population to better understand what people were seeing when they viewed a plant, what they thought of when someone said the word plant, and kind of to assess value using some human figure drawing frameworks.
And just to add to that, so the idea of the third grader comes from psychology research. And so looking at psychology research, there's been a lot of studies done with children's drawings, and just in general, if somebody isn't trained to see more detail and understand more detail, generally a third grade drawing is approximately the same as what an adult would be if they've never been taught to see the value, understand what it looks like, things like that. And this has been used in like facial recognition and things like that.
And that ties into this concept of mental models that's really part of the focus of your research. Can you just kind of explain what that means?
Well, the idea originally came to me after reading some facial recognition research, and the mental model of a face that we all have, of what a human face looks like, is very based on where we grew up. And facial recognition research showed us that if people grew up in a relatively uniform community, primarily white, primarily black, primarily Hispanic, then their mental model of a face had features that were characteristic of those populations. But people who grew up in a biracial community had a mental model of a face that was far more diverse, and they were able to be more flexible with their mental model. So essentially, it's like this pattern of features that we use to help us identify people. And in facial recognition, this was one of the bases of kind of discrediting eyewitness accounts in cases, especially if it was between races. And I was wondering if there was kind of this simplified mental model of plants, or what kind of mental model was predominant across the population. And so that was kind of the framework or the basis of where that aspect of our research came from.
Yeah, so this is very similar to how Inuit people have more words for snow than, say, somebody who is in South America might have. So the more that you're exposed to something, the more that you can kind of tell those more subtle differences between different kinds of the same general item or object, right?
Yeah, I had actually given an example from, I finished my undergrad degree and was starting my master's, and I had always worked with water and wetlands, but I'd never worked with the plant piece of it. And I remember my advisor at the time, who was brilliant with plants, he brought me out in the field and he took me to this really degraded prairie area. It probably had 3 or 4 species. And he's like, look at this, it's really been degraded. It's not very good. And I looked at it and I was like, it's grass. That's all I see. It's grass. And then he took me out to this really, Paula's shaking her head actually as we have this discussion, but and he took me out to this really native prairie and he was like, now look at this. Do you see all the difference? Do you see, all the different species? And I was like, still plants. It is still a field of plants. Like, that is what I saw. But I didn't grow up looking at plants. I grew up on a farm, but it was crops and things like that. And I never really looked at the plants. It was, again, that backdrop. And so, yeah, if we have more experience, we put more detail into it and have a better mental model.
Totally. Yeah, it's funny. After I read your article, I would take walks to my local library, and it was like a half an hour walk along a bunch of forested area. And I started seeing, actually paying attention to it. And I was like, oh, wow, there's wild grapes here, or just random things. Or what kind of flower is that? Or that's kind of like a dandelion, but the stem is different. And so it really is amazing when you actually stop and look, which is part of what makes this project so exciting. So moving on then, we haven't actually talked about what the project itself was. So can you tell us, now that we know you were looking to see what third graders were seeing out in the wild and how they conceptualize plants, can you tell me how you designed your experiment to do this research?
Yeah, absolutely. So my first intentions with my methodology were, again, towards understanding the best features to include when creating field guides. And so what we did, we had an established field group. So from 2006 until 2015, I worked for the Minnesota State University Moorhead's Regional Science Center, which is adjacent to Buffalo River State Park in Minnesota. And so we've had third grade classrooms come out since the 80s and take part in curriculum-based field trips. And part of those field trips included drawings. And so I worked with the teachers and basically said, hey, would you mind if you left some of your drawings behind so that I could see, what third graders see when they look at plants? And the teachers agreed. If they didn't agree, then they didn't leave their drawings. So we were working with curriculum artifacts. And what my intentions were to characterize and classify the different features that showed up in the drawings and then use those to inform a better field guide. What happened was the drawings were horrible, even though the cue to the students was we would like you to draw this plant because I'm going to come back and find your plant using your drawing. And so there was a lot of encouragement to put as much detail into their drawing as possible. And in general, we still only got 3 features: stems, leaves, and flowers. Sometimes even when there wasn't actually flowers on the plant they were looking at. So at that point in time, as in most science and kind of new approaches to studying a phenomenon, we took a step back and went, oh, well, that didn't work, but it's still interesting. So what do we need to know to make sense of what we found? And it was then that we became pretty stuck. And I had the fortune of knowing a former kindergarten teacher who worked here at North Dakota State University in our Center for Writers. And I went to her with this problem and I said, I don't know how to make sense of this data. I'm not sure what I don't know. And she looked at it and she's like, what you're doing looks a lot like human figure drawing from psychology. She's like, we used to use it to determine developmental stages in children when I taught kindergarten. She's like, have you looked into this? And I said, no, I've never even heard of this. And so I dug into it and I went, oh my God, this is it. This is what I need to know in order to make sense of what I have. And so we went back the next year to a different group of third graders, and we just asked them before they went out on the prairie in the spring to draw the first thing they thought of when I said plant, when I said flower, when I said tree, and when I said grass. And they were told that if they thought of the same thing, that was okay. They could draw the same thing twice. And what we got were a lot of cartoon daisies and a lot of puffy blobs with 2 lines to represent trees and a lot of lines to represent grass. And all of a sudden, those original drawings from my original group of third graders started making sense, because the pictures that I got in my attempts at identifying mental models were the same errors that had been found in my original data set. And in addition, they were at the same level of simplicity. There were only a few drawings in the mix that had more than 3 or 4 features included in them. And there were very few drawings of just a general plant that had more than 3 features. And so that's when we started getting some traction and things started to make a little bit of sense.
Hi everyone, I hope you're enjoying the show. Interested in learning more? Christina and Paula's article, Analysis of Children's Drawings to Gain Insight into Plant Blindness, published in Natural Sciences Education, will be freely available for the next 2 weeks. You can find a link to it in our show notes. If you're a certified crop advisor or certified professional soil scientist, there are continuing education units available for this episode. You can find a link to it on certifiedcropadvisor.org or our show notes. Let's get back to the show. That's amazing. I think this entire project is so fascinating because it's just such a great nexus of psychology and science and art, and I adore that. And also those pictures are they're so cute. So I highly recommend anybody go check out the paper. It will be freely available for the next 2 weeks. We'll have a link in the show notes. But yeah, super, super cute pictures. But so you're talking about these cues. How do you define what a cue is and really tell that someone is not just operating off of this kind of vague model versus actually recording or paying attention to what they see?
So cues were defined as kind of any, this is going to be a little circular as I try and explain this, so I apologize. Any feature that was included. So if they drew a leaf, that was a cue. If they added venation, that was a cue. If they added a flower, that was a cue. Number of petals was also identified as a cue because it helped us identify how closely students were looking at the plant. Some students surprisingly actually drew accurate number of petals when they were asked to draw a bloodroot. Most were not. Most students, when drawing things like bloodroot or wild leek, were able to accurately identify how many leaves were there. So leaf number was also something that we looked at. But interestingly, when drawing poison ivy, oftentimes the leaf number was not correct. Even though the whole leaves of 3 let it be rhyme is something that's pretty common in our area. And so cues were things that could be used to accurately identify the plant or misidentify the plant if they're viewed wrong.
And how nitty-gritty do you go with this? I mean, are you looking at, I think one of the examples maybe that was mentioned in the paper in talking about what's useful in a field guide is if a leaf edge is smooth or serrated, is that a separate cue than having leaves? And how do you know, like, when to stop, like, oh, well, this one had 7 serrated leaf edges versus 5. I mean, how do you distinguish that?
When it came to that level, like if they were looking at, let's say, poison ivy and they drew smooth leaves versus serrated leaves, that was definitely a cue. However, the accuracy of the serrations was depending on the plant included or not included. Part of that was based on, so prior to this drawing activity, students were introduced to the plants. So they got some natural history on them, limited natural history on them. And one of the things that was called out for poison ivy example is that they are asymmetrical leaves. And so if that was represented within their drawings, that was identified as a cue. Most did not draw asymmetrical leaves or serrations, but for those that did, they were cued at a higher level than those that did not.
Yeah, I'm just getting like flashbacks to art class when we'd have to do like the still lifes, and the teacher would be like, you need to pay attention to the actual shape that's there rather than what you think a jar looks like, because if you go off what you think a jar looks like, it's going to be wrong. And I was never good at that. Still life's not my strong suit. But it's also interesting because you're working with, kids, and I wouldn't think that a third grader would have something more complex or would pay attention to those things. But then you think, sure, an adult would be better, but they're actually not. So it's funny, you're kind of putting third graders to a task that you would think would be above them, but then it doesn't matter when they become adults anyway, because they don't have the training to see it. But you actually worked with an unofficial sample size that was a little bit older. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so in some of my classes, I teach a number of classes, and as Paula was working on things, I got curious, basically, and I thought, I got to test this on my college students. And so keep in mind, too, these students, not official, we don't have an official sample, it wasn't set up as a study design or anything like that, but in a couple different classes, and these are generally natural resource management majors, anywhere from freshmen to seniors, so they are outdoorsy people. They maybe should think about plants, maybe shouldn't. It all depends. And so I just kind of said, I did the same thing. I said, okay, pull out a piece of paper, put it into 4 sections. And in the one section, I want you to draw for me what's a plant. In the next one, I want you to draw a flower, a tree, and grass. And I will be honest, it came out really similar. I mean, we didn't code them. We don't have the exact statistics, but generally a plant a lot of times was that daisy-like flower. I don't know where the daisy comes from. Everybody loves the daisy, I guess. And the tree, and so that was generally the flower. And then the tree, it always is just that cloud with 2 lines that go down to the ground. So you got your trunk, and then you've got the cloud-like, leaves at the top. And then grass is those lines. It's just, a couple lines of grass. There was maybe 1 or 2 students that would actually put a little more detail in it. And yes, I did tend to find that they were either more attuned to plants or they had an art background of some sort. And so they actually thought about, say with the grass, they thought about a stem and they thought about the leaves and things like that. But generally, you wouldn't have been able to tell the difference between the college students and the third graders. They would have looked exactly the same.
And adding to that, there were a few teachers during my study that also took part in the drawings. And I actually had to go back and have them find their drawings and label it with a T because I couldn't tell the difference between the teachers and the third graders. And I've also done this at conferences, specifically the National Association of Interpreters. So people who go out and do interpretation of the natural sciences and history and whatnot. And I didn't do all 4. I asked them to report on what is a plant. And about 66%, 67% of that population, so professionals in education, drew the cartoon daisy.
Oh my gosh.
There's a love of the cartoon daisy.
Yes.
There is a love of the cartoon daisy. I was thinking about that as you're talking about it, and I thought, I mean, I guess when you're young, if you see like classroom decorations that are plant themed, they kind of do fall a lot more into that cartoon daisy. So maybe that's part of it, is the exposure of the things you see, or, you know, kids' movies might default to that if they're running through a field or whatever. So maybe that's part of it.
If I could add to that, there's only been one population I've ever surveyed that has come back differently. And again, these were informal, but those were Native American students from the Turtle Mountain Reservation. It was a small group, and every single person in that small group drew a different plant.
That is crazy. Oh, that's so cool. I love your research. I just love it. Yeah, and if anyone wants to try this just as obviously an informal study and ask their colleagues or family or whatever, please feel free to send those to us on Twitter or whatnot. We would be happy to see your results as well. So fascinating. I just love it. And also interesting because I feel like if someone just asked me to draw a plant out of the blue, I would have maybe a different expectation than if someone was like, this is for research and I need you to draw like a detailed plant. Because I know that I could easily just default to, you know, a very simple flower if someone was just like, hey, draw a flower. But if someone asked me for very specific details, but I guess that kind of leads back to your original first stab at it with the specific flowers anyway. It didn't seem to make a difference there either. So much work to be done. But speaking of working with third graders, you had some really unique challenges in choosing this age group specifically as the focus of your research. Can you talk a little bit about some of those challenges?
So yeah, working with elementary school students and working with youth basically under the age of 18 is a huge challenge for a lot of researchers. So I have another past PhD student, her name was Corey Bunnell. She published an article looking at the challenges of conducting research with adolescents in public schools. It was published in 2018 also in Natural Sciences Education. But looking at that and understanding kind of the history, so that when we look at the history of the Institutional Review Board and working with certain populations, there are certain protected populations, and it's been done for a good reason because there's been certain groups that have been treated very unfairly. Basically, they've been used in a lot of research studies that were not appropriate. For example, in our history, there is an example of a syphilis study where people, Paula's face right now is, oh my. But yeah, it very inappropriate things were done. And so there's certain protected populations, those under the age of 18, who generally aren't necessarily allowed to speak for themselves. Prison populations is another group, as well as people with special needs. And so looking at any group that you study, you have to do an institutional review board, basically documentation. And so the colleges have them. We actually would have had to work through Minnesota State University Moorheads as well as NDSU's because the research was at their science center, and then NDSU has their own. But anytime you do a research study, the IRB has to essentially evaluate it and look at what you're asking these groups. And so with elementary school kids, they can't necessarily speak for themselves. And so, but yet at the same time, their parents can agree to taking part in a study, but they can still themselves choose to not take part. And so say we had these third graders and we had there was things we would have loved to have asked them, like understand basically ethnicity or which school they go to. And so being able to compare some demographic features. However, in order to do that, we would have had to go through the full IRB review. And at that point in time, the child would have had to have signed off on agreeing to take part in the study, as well as their parent agreeing to have them take part in the study. And so that level of documentation is really challenging. And so For this particular study, while we would have loved to have learned some of those things that are left as artifacts of a field trip that they were already going on, and they don't have any identifying information, those are okay to study because they're not linked to a certain child. They're not linked to a certain person, as they are protected population, and there's a lot of challenges of working with those groups.
Fascinating. Another just really interesting aspect of this research, and obviously not something that typically comes up on our show. We're usually not working with children in our field studies. So obviously we have talked quite a bit about some of your results right now, but is there anything else you want to share about what you found? Maybe some other research that's been done on this? I know another study from Brazil was mentioned in your paper. Anything about either of those?
Yeah, so the Brazil study was pretty interesting. It was a smaller sample size, and they looked at students K through 5, I believe.
Or first through 5 or K through 5, but it was similar, yes.
And they did the field parts like we did where they were out in nature, but then they actually collected an herbarium sample and then had them do a drawing and followed up with an interview. So they had a few more steps involved in their research, but even from students with Brazil, the highest number of characteristics that they could count on a student drawing was 5. And so we found 3 here in Minnesota, North Dakota, and even students who were in more arguably biodiverse or at least charismatic floral plant communities were only adding a couple of more features to their plants, one of which was roots. And depending on where they were looking and doing their field work, depending on kind of the ecosystem they were in, some of those more rainforest-like plants the roots are exposed, so they may actually be visible, whereas ours were not. And so I wonder, there are a few variations in our data sets, but overall they were rather similar considering the drastic difference in the location.
Yeah, totally. Like a mangrove forest would maybe have more roots or that kind of thing. That's fascinating too. I was just thinking, I was like, well, what would you do if you just were like on like, a step or something where there's not as much, or, there's just more lichen and moss than actual plants, like how that would change, If you don't live where there are daisies, then maybe you don't draw the daisy. We're going to stop here for this episode. Next episode, we'll discuss Paula and Christina's results, how things like Harry Potter, cryptology, and grocery stores relate to plant blindness, and areas of future research. Thanks for listening. Thank you for listening to Field Lab Earth. You'll find a link to today's paper and other resources for this episode in our show notes or on our website. If you have any questions, comments, or recommendations for show topics, please contact us at podcast@sciencesocieties.org or on Twitter @FieldLabEarth. If you'd like to hear more content like this, please subscribe, and don't forget to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or anywhere else you find your podcast if you like our show. This podcast is a joint production of the American Society of Agronomy, Crop Science Society of America, and Soil Science Society of America. Special thanks to Lobo Loco for the use of their song Spook Castle on the intro and outro of our show. Opinions and conclusions expressed by authors are their own and are not considered as those of the American Society of Agronomy, Crop Science Society of America, Soil Science Society of America, its staff, its members, or its advertisers.